first thing that we did last time was looked at a philosophical defense of the second premise. And so if you have your handout, you can see that the second premise is that the universe began to exist. The universe began to exist. The first premise was, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. And so the first class that we did on the Kalam cosmological argument, which was 2 weeks ago, we looked at that first premise. Last week we started a discussion on the second, which was, again, that the universe began to exist. And so the first thing we did was looked at a philosophical defense. We said that the past events, if it is infinite, if the past is infinite, it was eternal, then the actual collection of past events is infinite. Okay, it is actually infinite, the past events, if the universe is eternal in the past. But we saw that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist, right? We looked at Hilbert's hotel, which shows the various absurdities that arise. If you have a hotel with infinite rooms, an infinite number of people show up, and all of these absurdities that arise. And so what you can do is you can listen to the recording from last time if you want to listen to that. But today we're going to discuss a new argument. It's another philosophical defense of the second premise, but it is independent of the argument that we gave last time. So, so this one is independent. And so even if you think that an actually infinite number of things can exist, this argument aspires to show that the series of past events cannot be actually infinite. The series of past events cannot be infinite. And so the series of past events, Ghazali, which was the 12th century Muslim theologian that we've been using as a springboard for this argument, Ghazali observes the series of past events has been formed by adding one event after another. One event after another. So the series of events in the past is almost like a series of dominoes, falling one after another until the last domino today is finally reached. But he argues that no series which is formed by adding one member after another can be actually infinite. For you cannot pass through an infinite number of elements one at a time. And so I think that this is actually easy to see when you're thinking about could we count to infinity? Could we actually count to infinity? Right, and so you're going to have to shake your head. No, we can't count to infinity. That is actually metaphysically impossible. No matter how high you count, you can always count one more number. Right, so therefore, no one can ever count in infinity, and he can go on. He can go on, and infinity will simply be a limit of the series of numbers. Right, it's just going to be an ideal limit, but you can never actually reach it. You can always count one more number because there's an infinity number of natural numbers, and so he will never actually reach infinity. But if you can't count, and think about this, so if you can't count to infinity, how could you count down from infinity? How can you count down from infinity? This would be like someone's claiming to have counted down all the negative numbers ending at 0. -3, -2, -1, 0. Right? And so that seems crazy to think about that. So before he could count -1, he would have to count -2. But before he could count -2, he would have to count -3, and so on, back to infinity. Right, and so before any specific number could be counted, an infinity of numbers would have already had to have been counted first. And so you just get driven back and back and back into the past so that no number could ever be counted, because there's always one more number that would have to be counted first. But then the final domino would never fall if an infinite number of dominoes had to fall first. So today could never be reached, and this is the basic argument. But obviously here we are, right? We're in the present moment. And so this shows that this series of past events must be finite and have a beginning. And so let's go ahead and open it up quickly for any comprehension type questions about this little argument here. Any questions, comments? Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So Al-Ghazali, again, this is the 12th century Muslim theologian. If you want to write his name down, you can. It's Al-Ghazali. You can actually look this guy up. He wrote a book in the 12th century criticizing the philosophers of his day who were propounding this idea that the universe was eternal. And so he wrote this book and showed how they were just completely incoherent. They were completely all writing these absurd things because of the various absurdities that arise. And so last time We saw some of those today. We're going to see a little bit more. So Al-Ghazali, his name again is A-L, and I would write this down. It's just we don't have a stand today. So Al-Ghazali, A-L-G-H-A-Z-A-L-I. And so he sought to heighten the impossibility of forming an actually infinite past by giving illustrations of this, of the absurdities that would result if you could form an actually infinite past by adding one member after another. Okay, he says, let's imagine our own solar system. Okay, so let's imagine our planets and our solar system. And let's imagine we have Saturn. We look up into the sky, we have Saturn. And so let's imagine that for every one orbit that Saturn completes around the sun, Jupiter, which is closer in, completes 2. Okay, so let's imagine this scenario. So every orbit that Saturn completes around the sun, Jupiter does 2 of those. Okay. So, and notice the longer that they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind Jupiter. Okay, so if Jupiter has done 10 trillion orbits, then Saturn has done how many? 5, right? 5 trillion orbits. That's just, the disparity grows larger and larger and larger as time goes on. And so the longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. And so if they continue to orbit forever, they will approach a limit at which Saturn is infinitely behind Jupiter. It's approaching. It's not going to be actually infinite. It's just going to be approaching infinite. So they won't have actually arrived at this infinite limit, but nevertheless they will approach this limit the longer they orbit. And so, but now let's turn the story around. Okay, says Al-Ghazali. Suppose that they had been orbiting the sun from eternity past. Okay, now which one has completed the most orbits? Right, so the answer mathematically is that the number of orbits completed is exactly the same. Okay, they both have completed an infinite number of orbits. But notice that you can't get out of this argument by saying that infinity is not a number. Okay, because it is a number in this case. We are dealing with an actually infinite number of orbits, so it is a number. Okay, so in mathematics, infinity is a number. In set theory, at least, it is a number of elements in the set of natural numbers, right? We saw that last time. So if they have been orbiting from eternity past at the rate of 2 orbits of Jupiter to every orbit of Saturn, they have now both completed the same number of orbits, which is absurd, right? But that seems obviously absurd because the longer they orbit, the more disparity between them grows, right? And so how does the number of orbits magically become equal just by having them orbit from eternity past? It just seems completely absurd, right? And so that's one illustration. And so here's another illustration. Suppose that we meet a man who claims to have been counting down from eternity past and is now finishing, like we did before. So -3, -2, -1, 0. Whew. At last. And so, but now we might ask this. We might ask, well, why did he just now finish his countdown? Okay, why did he just now finish his countdown? Why didn't he finish it yesterday, or the day before that, or the year before that? After all, by then an infinite amount of time had already elapsed, right? So if the man were counting, say, at the rate of 1 number per second, he's already had an infinite number of seconds to finish his countdown. He should already be done. In fact, at any point in the infinite past you pick, the man will have already be finished with his countdown because he had already completed an infinite number of seconds of counting, which implies that no matter how far back you go, you will never be able to find the man counting. And so that contradicts the hypothesis that he's been counting from eternity. And so this, again, I think shows the absurdity of trying to form an actually infinite by adding one member after another. And so we're actually speeding through this lesson today. But I wanted to open it up for a discussion again at this point. So if we have any discussion, any objections that you might think of, really think hard. Let's try to press this argument and see if there's any holes in it. Conroy, what are you thinking over there? Our go-to skeptic.
It's kind of scary that you can tell what I'm thinking.
Good morning.
Well, I mean, I was just kind of thinking, can God create something outside of time to where it is infinite? Like, can he create infinity? Is the question.
Okay, it's a good question.
Because if he can create infinity,
then it should be possible, right?
Then, I mean, can God do that?
Okay.
Is the question.
Okay, and so when we discussed God's omnipotence, we talked about the various absurdities, the omnipotence paradoxes. And so what these were is basically asking, can God create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it? These sorts of absurdities or these paradoxes. But as we saw that this is not really a problem. And the reason is because God can't do what is metaphysically impossible. What these are is these are just words that are strung together that don't mean anything. They don't really mean anything. And so when we want to say that God can do what is possible, what is metaphysically possible for him to do, or really anyone in that situation to be able to do, that doesn't mean that he can do what is metaphysically impossible. So, with that said, if it is impossible to create a series of events or a collection of things that is actually infinite, if that is impossible, then it's no impingement on God to say that he can't do it, right? Because that's a metaphysically impossible state of affairs to bring about. And so it's not an impingement on God's omnipotence to say that he can't do this or do that if it's metaphysically impossible, that anyone be able to do that. And so if we think that these arguments are good, what that would lead us to believe is that even God couldn't do these things because there aren't actually things to be done. Okay, they're just words strung together that don't actually have any referent. It just doesn't mean anything. And so it's not an impingement on God's omnipotence. It's just to say that these things are really metaphysically impossible. You can't have an infinite collection of things in reality, and so we wouldn't expect God to be able to do that. It's like suggesting God should be able to create a square circle, right? It's sort of along those lines, or God should be able to create a married bachelor.
So it's almost saying that he can create infinity going forward, but not backwards.
So this is another good question. So I'm really glad. This is why I went to Conroy. He's always thinking about these things, and it pushes us to discover, to look into these issues further. So again, what we distinguished between last time was the potential infinite and the actual infinite. Okay, and so a potential infinite is basically a limit. Okay, so again, we can think of counting to infinity. So we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we could do that forever. We could continually count. We would never actually reach it, though. That's the point, is that we wouldn't actually reach infinity. Infinity would serve as a limit to us, a limit concept. Okay, so we could continue counting and counting and counting and counting. We would never reach infinity. On the other hand, an actual infinite is an actual infinite collection of things. Okay, so we have a mathematician in class, and so the set of natural numbers. So the set of natural numbers is infinite. Okay, there are an infinite number of natural numbers. And so when we want to think about the set, the collection of the natural numbers, that collection is actually infinite. Okay, but so let's go back to the question that Conroy asked, which was, so God can create a future infinite, but he can't really create a past infinite. Okay, is that sort of the question? Okay, so what he could do is create a potential infinite in this case. If these arguments are sound, what's happening is that he's actually set the world up so that the future would be potentially infinite. Okay, so we'd always have one more event after another toward infinity. But like the guy counting, we would never actually reach infinity. Okay, it would just be a potential infinite. And so, but we can't have that in the past, right? The past series of events would have to be finite because we've just seen that the series of events can't be actually infinite. And so that would be the answer there, is that the future would be potentially infinite. It wouldn't be actually infinite. Which we could go further into that question, but I don't want to go there. But that's the basic response. Did you want to add something?
Well, no, because I'm a teacher and these kids ask me this all the time. So you said mathematician, I'm getting ready to go there. So why in the world do we have negative numbers if there is nothing backwards below zero?
Because negative numbers are included in the set of numbers.
Okay,
yeah.
But then if we cannot go backwards, because it's been driving me crazy ever since I started school, and it's still driving the kids crazy, why in the world do we need algebra? And if there's nothing below zero, because time can go backwards, he created time, then why in the world do we need negative numbers?
We would need to go into that question a little bit further. It's like, what do you mean by the statement that we can't go backwards? We can't go below zero.
Because you said God goes forward and not backwards. And see, it was funny because we were watching I haven't seen them, but what is it? Luke Skywalker, whatever that thing is.
Star Wars
thing, and I didn't know they made prequels in 2 movies.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Till last night. So how could you go back and make a movie before a movie? So that made me think about it last night. How can you go back and make characters after the characters, before the characters, whatever? So then the same thing, like with math. We've been learning math all our life, and all of a sudden they come up with algebra. So there's a numbers before zero. So in time, how can you have time before time? So they talk about time machines before there were time machines. So this goes into the thing. So the kids been asking all our lives, why do we have to learn algebra when you can't make money before money? So if there's nothing before money, if before you have a dollar, then why do you need negative numbers? If you have no money, there is no money.
That
Right?
yeah, I wouldn't even know. Yeah, I wouldn't even know where to go with that.
It's the Bible, but
Yeah.
So if you're trying to explain to kids, and these are Christian kids, they come back on Sunday after church and they say, okay, so we're going to go all our lives. If there's nothing before nothing, why do we need after?
See, to me,
that?
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I'm a minister, so they come back and they ask me after class.
Right.
Minister Mason, this makes absolutely no sense.
I totally, as a retired high school teacher and now teaching math at college, I totally get what you're saying because that's what they always ask. But here's what I share with my students. Here's why it's unreasonable to them and it doesn't make sense. Because the set of all numbers, all real numbers, is so big that where they're framing their reference to is what they began to learn. And because that set was so big, there was no way in the beginning we could have just taught them to count. And they knew that between 0 and 1 was 1/2, 1/3, 1/4. The negative numbers weren't introduced to them. And because for so long, all they dealt with was positive numbers, then to them, realistically, that's what exists. And so when we come back in and try to add on to their belief, right, that's where we run into issues because they were always
But that's exactly where I wanted you to go. Because exactly now, when we wanted to teach them about God, that's why I wanted them to go there.
Right.
When we try to teach a kid about God, that God existed before time, that's where we run into trouble with the Bible.
Okay.
That's why I wanted them to go.
So we actually talked about God's relationship to time in our doctrine of God. But let me just say very quickly. So the question about numbers and what. So we want to ask the question: what are numbers? What are numbers? Are they just things that we made up in our mind? Are they concepts, or are they actually entities? Are they entities in the world? And so, if we believe that numbers are merely concepts in someone's mind, then I don't see that there's any problem. Okay. And so I think most Christians would want to believe something like this: is that numbers, while they actually apply to the physical world, they are really concepts in either in our mind or in God's mind. Okay, and so God would actually have the concept of every number because His mind is infinite, but ours is finite. We can only know a certain amount of things, and so ours, the knowledge that we have of the numbers is going to be limited. But so I think the question would have to go back to what are numbers? What are we actually using them to represent when we say that you can't do anything with negative numbers? And so if they're just concepts in our mind, then there doesn't seem to be any problem. So that's what I would sort of say to that. But there are other good questions about the time and God's relationship to time before time began to exist, which that doesn't really make sense. How can there be a before time? So that there's a lot of questions there. But we talked about some of that back in the doctrine of God.
when I was learning calculus, we would replace the numbers with symbols. So that's where I kind of relate to seeing numbers as concepts. So you could replace any negative, any positive number with symbols and complete the entire equation, and then convert it back into numbers and get the correct answer. And I don't know why I thought that was easier for us to learn it that way, but I mean that's how we learned it.
Yeah, we use symbols all the time in math, and so like when we looked at the potential infinite, the lazy 8, the sideways lazy 8 is to represent the potential infinite. And then there's the aleph null, which is the alphabet, or the Hebrew alphabet letter A. I've erased it here. But that represents an actually infinite. It represents the set of natural numbers. And so that it is still a symbol, but it does represent a real number, right? It represents a number, which is the infinite set of natural numbers. And so, yeah, we use symbols all the time, but they do represent real numbers. And so that's, I think, also important to this argument that we were looking at today. Conroy, do you have any other objections or questions? Do you agree that these first two philosophical defenses are good arguments? Do you think that they warrant the belief in the second premise?
I'm not 100%.
Good. Good. And so I want to continuously encourage everyone that these arguments are not based on the Bible. They're not divinely given. So we should be, I think, initially skeptical of them. We don't want to hear an argument that supports a conclusion we want to believe and then just go all in for it. Right? We want to investigate these arguments, not just on what I say here in class. And as convincing as I might sound, I think we need to go further into these arguments. And so if you have any questions, you want to look into it further, then definitely do so. Don't just leave it at that. Don't just leave it at what you hear in class and then want to go give it to someone else who might have objections that we didn't cover here or anything like that. And so just be diligent and be, go in and look into these arguments if they're interesting you. And so, yeah.
So is the time that God operates on the same as, the time that we've come to understand? Like years, minutes. You said there was a discussion that you guys did on
So we talked a little bit about God's relationship to time, and this is going to get into a lot of interesting discussions. Okay, so what is God's relationship to time? How did God exist prior to the creation of the world? And so the conclusion that I come to, and the conclusion of William Lane Craig, who is, again, the teacher of this class. He has a lot of great work on his website, reasonablefaith.org. He actually did for years, he studied God's relationship to time. And so this is the conclusion, that he came to. And he has several books written on the subject. If you want to look into those, you can do so. I think Time in Eternity is one. I may get that title wrong, but just look into William Lane Craig and time, and you'll be able to pull up all his books on it. So if this is an interesting question for you, I would say look first at his stuff. So I can only provide like an overview of things that I've looked into. I haven't looked into it very deeply. But, okay, so with that said, so Craig believes that without the universe, God exists timelessly. Okay, without time, there are no temporal relations. He doesn't stand in any sort of temporal. Temporal just means like a time relation. So he doesn't stand in a time relation to anything without the universe. Okay, so timeless, without the universe, and then at the moment of creation, God entered into time. And so he operates on the same time, if you want to put it in that way that we do. Now, we use minutes and we use seconds and we use years because we live on the planet Earth and we calculate how long it takes us to do an orbit around the sun. Okay, and so God can still use that. He understands what that increment means, but that's just something useful for us because we can relate to that personally because we live on the planet Earth. And so we orbit around the sun, and so we can calculate the time it takes to go around the sun, then we can divide that into to days and then to years and to weeks and all that kind of stuff into seconds. And so for us, that sort of makes sense. But for God, maybe he has some sort of different reference, or he has some sort of different increment that he uses to represent time. That I don't think is really going to matter that much. He would just have a different understanding, a different unit, sort of like the difference between an inch and a centimeter. Okay, so it's just a different way of looking at the same thing. Okay, you're still measuring distance, you're still measuring time, it's just you look at a different increment. And so that would be sort of God's relationship to time on this view, is that without the universe, God exists timelessly. With the universe, at the moment of creation, God entered into time, and so he stands in temporal relations with us. For instance, God knows right now that it is... Let me pull up my time. So God knows the truth that it is 9:29 a.m. where we are, right, in relation to where we are. So he knows that fact because he's omniscient. Okay, he knows all only in all truths. Okay, so he knows that it is 9:29 right now. But if he knows that, he's got to be in time. You can't know that if you're not in time. So for instance, if you wanted to go back to the year 1400, if someone living in 1400 can't know that it is now 9:29 in 2016, okay? Someone back then couldn't know that because they're not in this moment. So they've got to be in this moment temporally. They've got to stand in that relation there. So they've got to be, there's got to be tensed facts about the world, like what is now, what was yesterday, what is the future. These are tensed facts, and a tensed fact is, and I can go on and on and on and on, but a tensed fact is actually indexed to a specific person or time. And so we can think about index as the something like here and there. Okay, so for instance, here right now is Tomball. Okay, for us, and there would be Barcelona. Okay, so this location is indexed to us. So when we say Tomball is here, that's because we're in Tomball. But if we were in Barcelona, here would be Barcelona. Okay, so that's what we mean by indexed, is that wherever you are. And so in time, when you're in 9:29, you're indexed to 9:29. And so God would have to be in that moment. If God were in 1400 or out of time completely, he couldn't know that it is now 9:29. Does that make sense? And so these are some of the questions that we got into the doctrine of God. But I don't want to go too far into that because, again, I haven't researched it that thoroughly at all. I've researched it enough for this class and the sort of basic things that we'll cover here. But if you want to go further, he's probably one of the most prolific authors on this subject. And he did, like I said, he did a huge study into this subject, to God and time, God's relationship to time. And there's different views. There's views that God is completely timeless. He never entered into time. There's views where God has always been in time. And so prior to the universe, God existed in an infinite series of past events. Which is, with these arguments, we're seeing that might not be something we want to believe because there's all these absurdities that arise. And so if these absurdities arise, then we shouldn't expect God to be able to do something like that. And this is sort of all of the reason why Dr. Craig believes this view, is that without the universe, God existed timelessly. There was no particles floating by him that would make it to where particle was there, then it's there, then it's there, then it's there. There's nothing like that because God is an immaterial being. But so there was no time without the universe. This is a view. Without the universe, God was timeless. At the moment of creation, God entered into time and stands in causal relations, stands in temporal relations with the universe, with things in the universe. And he also knows tensed facts. He knows what time it is now. He knows what time it was. Okay, so, and he can only know that if he's in the present moment. Okay, just like we are, right? As we're in class here, it was 9 o'clock, and now it's 9:33 or whatever. It's 9:32. Okay, and so we've existed in each of those moments, and so God would have to exist in each of those moments in order to know it is now 9:01, it is now 9:02, it is now 9:03. And since God knows all true propositions, all true facts, he would sort of have to exist in time. And so there's different, like I said, there's different views. There are some Christians who say that God is completely timeless. He doesn't need to know that kind of stuff, but that's another question.
No, it's okay.
You were going to say that?
Well, I don't believe that God have to be in time to know time. And that's what Cameron just said, that God would have to be in time to know time. I believe that if God is out of time, he still knows 9:29 in time. That's just my belief, right? So I don't believe that he has to be in time to know time. That's just me.
And so I would prod Conroy to the ends of the earth to understand what he means by that and how it could possibly make sense. Because to me, that doesn't make any sense. But Conroy and I love each other, and we would have a great discussion about that.
Well, actually, there's a Bible verse that I wish I remember where it was, but
We have time, so we might be able to look
We
it
can
up.
look it up. Well, the Bible verse that mentions that in where I am, 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. I believe where God exists, His time is not our time.
Right.
We're His created beings. The universe is what He created, and then He put that on time. But where He exists, there is no time.
Okay.
But there's also another mention in the Old Testament where He allots people 120 years to live because I forgot exactly what it said, but I know that it mentions time there too, and His patience not being that long lasting with men. So yeah, I'm gonna look up that verse because that.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think it basically goes exactly like that. I think it's in the Psalms. Hey! What are you doing? You hear my voice? So I think it's in the Psalms, okay? And so first thing that we would need to look at with the Psalms is that the Psalms are really, really poetic, okay? And so we shouldn't want to take these as expressing literal truths if that isn't the genre that it is. It's like so if you look at the Song of Solomon, okay, there's so much poetry in that book, all right? And we wouldn't want to take everything that's in there completely literally. That would just be completely incorrect, okay, because it's not the kind of genre that it is. And so first thing we need to do is look at the genre of what it is. And so if there are these poetic elements, then we want to interpret it that way. We want to say that, when the Bible said, that doesn't mean that we just exclude everything. But I would say that what we would want to, an interesting way to look at it that's consistent with the view that Dr. Craig holds would be to say that He's an infinite being. And so it might seem as though 1,000 years to us, because we are so limited in what we know and what we experience, God has experienced, if the universe is however many years old, billions of years old, then God has experienced all of this. And so 1,000 years is literally like nothing to Him.
Right.
Okay, even if He does exist in time. So for us, a day is really, really important because we only live, 100 years or so. And so, but for God, He's been around for, if the scientists are correct, billions of years. And so for Him, again, it wouldn't be, he sort of transcends time in that sense. Not that He's outside of time necessarily, but that He doesn't view time in the same way that we do. So 1,000 years to Him is going to be like a second because He's been around for, He literally would have watched the process of the universe and everything else. And so I would say that that's a consistent way to view that passage in conjunction with Dr. Craig's views, that God is in time at the moment of creation. And again, got to go back, and it's so important that we interpret the Bible correctly. Okay, because if we don't interpret it correctly, then we're going to believe false things that the Bible was never intended to actually teach. We can't look at the Bible through our modern eyes and want to interpret it just literally, just superficially off the top of our head. Just because that's what we, as modern thinkers want to read into the text. We want to just read everything literally. We just want to say that it is 1,000 years to God. 1,000 years is as a day to God. And so but we need to keep in mind that the genre of literature that it is, when it was written, what the author would have understood when he wrote it, and in addition to that, what the audience of that time would have understood that to be. And so more than likely it would have been something poetic, something beautiful that they would have understood. And so I don't think that they were actually thinking of, A theory and B theory of time and, God's relation, anything like that. They were just thinking that this is a beautiful passage and it shows that God is sort of beyond us in that sense, is that we experience things and our time here is so limited and we're so... We're like cusps in the wind. We just float on by, and we come into being and we go out of being just like that. But God has been around. He exists necessarily. He's been around forever. And so I said a lot of that to just say we need to be careful about what the Bible says about what kind of genre literature it is, and then the author, the audience. And all of that kind of stuff. And all of this is actually stemming from the fact I'm reading a book on biblical interpretation. And so I would encourage you to look into that as well. I mean, that is so important for us, that we understand how to interpret the Bible. Because we shouldn't just come at it at face value. I think that we can still learn good things. If we do that, we can still learn important things out of the Bible. But if we want to take the Bible seriously and we want to know exactly what it was meaning to convey, then we do need to take genre seriously. We do need to take the time, the culture that it was written in seriously. We need to take the author or the implied author, the implied audience, and all of that into consideration before we get to the interpretation that we arrive at. Before we come to the knowledge that is supposed to be expressed to us, who are in the modern culture, thousands of years removed from this other culture that it was written in, and all of that is so important. I can't get over the fact of how important that is.
You are correct in your genre. The scripture you want is Psalms 90 and 4. Psalm 90 and 4. And then that's your Old Testament scripture, and it's referenced in 2 Peter 3 and 8 as the promise fulfilled. He referenced it back to the promise.
So there you go. 2 Peter was written by Peter, which was the rock Petra.
3 and 8.
Got it.
Okay.
On this Petro, I will point my Petra. That's something else. So let's go back and review very quickly, because we're about to move on to some announcements and stuff that we have coming up. So today we covered the second philosophical defense of the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. It's a very, very interesting argument, I think, as we're seeing. And so, like I was explaining to Conroy, we need to make sure that we're approaching this argument, and every argument that we're discussing, we should approach them carefully. We need to make sure that these arguments are good arguments and that we're convinced by them, not just that we want to believe them because they lead to conclusions that we like. If they're bad arguments, we need to reject them as bad arguments. Okay, that doesn't mean that we need to be overly skeptical. We just need to approach them correctly. We need to make sure that we weigh them for the evidence that they provide. Next time we're going to be discussing, we're going to move on to the scientific defense of the second premise. And these are really, really interesting. They're a little bit, I'm going to try to pull back on how much science is involved in these defenses, but they're still going to be very, very interesting. And so what you might be interested to learn is that science actually backs this second premise quite strongly. And so that's what we'll be discussing next time. And so moving on to announcements, this Saturday we're having our second Coffee and Theology meetup. Okay, it's going to be November 5th. And I have it written down, or we had it written down last time. This is the address if you need to write it down there. It's also on the city if you need to look it up. But, okay, so what is the point of these Coffee and Theology meetups? So these are a chance to invite people who may not be able to come so early on a Sunday morning, or they might just have a sort of like nominal interest in Christianity. Some friends of yours that might be skeptical, that might not really know what they believe. This is the perfect opportunity to invite them. We don't have a specific outline that we're covering or anything like that. We're just getting together and opening it up for discussion. And so this is a perfect opportunity, like I said, to invite people, friends, family members that you might think that they would get something out of it. And it might also encourage them to come, visit the class and come into the class. But so November 5th, which is this Saturday, 6 to 8 p.m., it's at the Louvre Bakery and Coffee Shop. It's right up the street off of Kirkendall. So we watched a video that they made of this coffee shop. It's beautiful. It looks awesome on the inside. So I'm sure that they have great coffee and food and pastries and stuff. So the last one was a huge success. We had about 20 people come to the last one, which is huge for like a meeting at a coffee shop. But we talked about a lot of interesting stuff. And so this time I'm expecting the same thing. So that's that. And then secondly, I've started a blog. And if you want to follow along that, you can. It's called CapturingChristianity.com. And so my passion as an apologist, if that's that can be a term that I use for myself, is an apologist. But so it's called CapturingChristianity.com. And so it's coming from the perspective of a photographer. approaching apologetics. And so I don't have a degree in natural theology or anything like that. I don't have a degree in apologetics. But what I do have is access to information. I can read books. I can read the Bible. I can read all of this stuff. I can listen to podcasts. And so the information that I'm gleaning, I'm going to share it. And what I want to do is encourage believers in the church to do the same thing, okay? Because what I've found is that the amount of time that I spend on a daily basis looking at Facebook, watching TV shows, that time that I've noticed that I actually kept track of this for a day, is I noticed how much time I was spending doing all of this frivolous stuff. And so what I do now is I read 2 separate books a day now. I read one book that's easier to read throughout the day during breaks and whatnot, and then I read another book at night for about an hour on a topic that's really a little bit deeper. And this is all in addition to having a wife and having a baby, and so in photography business and a blog and everything else, and coffee and theology. And so I've found time. There's no reason that anyone else wouldn't be able to find time either. But I want to encourage, the whole point of this blog, Capturing Christianity, is to encourage just your average Christian. So it's going to be at that level. I'm not going to go super deep and use all these $5 words in this blog. It's going to be very, very, I suppose if you want to call it entry level. It's going to be any Christian should be able to pull it up and look at it. For instance, I was talking earlier about a blog entry I did on the definition of faith. That's a very, very interesting topic. What is the definition of faith? Is faith just blind faith? Is faith something like a leap in the dark? And so in that blog post, I describe 3 different uses of the word faith, and then show how the third definition is actually a biblical definition, and it's nothing like blind faith. It's actually the witness of the Holy Spirit working in us to produce knowledge. And that kind of thing you're not going to hear from a skeptic. A skeptic usually isn't going to say something like that. They want to say that faith is just blind faith and there's no real good reason to use faith on anything because it's just a blind leap in the dark. But so the stuff like that, topics like that is what I'll be talking about. The next series of blog posts that I'll be writing is on the rationality of Christian belief. Can Christian belief be rational? We already talked about that in class. We talked about the first argument we looked at was the proper basicality of belief in God, whether or not belief in God can be properly basic and justified in that way. And so I'll be writing blog posts on that. And also these... You like the blog, baby? So I'm also making it a point to keep these blog posts very short. So they're very, very easy reads. They're 500 words, which takes 2 to 3 minutes to read. Okay, so that's another thing that I'll be concentrating on. And if you want to follow along, you have questions, you have comments, feel free. There's also, you can subscribe on the website. Actually, the subscribe is not working right now. I don't know why I said that. But if you want to subscribe and get like daily emails or updates when there's new posts. Here, baby. Hey, baby. If you want to get updates on new posts, then just give me your email and I'll put you into the system. But with that, let me go ahead and close out in prayer. So God, we thank you for today. We thank you for this.
Oh, she's going to get it.
Yeah, that's close. All right, so once again, let's go to the Lord in prayer. So God, we thank you for this opportunity to come together and to discuss these important issues once again. And we thank you for everyone that was able to make it to class today, including those that made it early. Awesome. So God, we thank you for that. We thank you for service today. Put the words that you have for Pastor to speak, put them on his lips, put them in his mind, God. We thank you for that. We thank you for the people that are coming to church today, that their hearts and their minds will be open and receptive to what is going to be going on today. And so we thank you for all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.